Are we being called by God? How do we know? Last week, we heard about Samuel being called in a dream. This seems to be fairly straightforward, but he still didn't recognize God calling. So, are we being called? And to what? God calls Jonah and reacts the way many of us would. Try to ignore him and run the other way. Jonah was reluctant, just as many of us. Can't you hear Jonah saying to God, "What do you mean you forgive them? After all you have put me through, and now you're not going to destroy them? You get me thrown overboard into the sea to drown. Then you have me swallowed inside this slimy fish, who spits me out on the hard ground with all this goo dripping off of me. And then you have them repent, and you forgive them and not destroy them? How could you do this to me? I didn't even want to do this in the first place, but you made me." We may be scared, but we need to believe in God. He knows what he needs us to do. Jonah, even in his reluctance, became a disciple because he had the courage to say yes to God. God shows us that he is persistent in the stories about Samuel and Jonah. He will remain calling us as long as it takes for us to start listening. We might even think that we are not good enough to be called by God, so we don't even try to listen. He would only call on the holy, successful, smart, popular, or persuasive. I know personally that God needed to be very persistent with me. It took me many, many years and many, many promptings to get my attention. And I can guarantee that I have none of the traits that we may think that God would be looking for. Even the disciples Jesus called in today's gospel would not be classified as saintly material according to our standards. Just look at Simon and Andrew, two fishermen, not the most prestigious profession. I'm sure their hands were calloused and rough, their facial features strong and weathered. I doubt they were the most educated or refined. When they spoke, they did not command an audience. And the same could be said with James and John. They were also fishermen. And then we can also look at Matthew, a detested tax collector. Most people would not want to come close to him, let alone to talk to him. And yet Jesus chose them to bring the good news to his people. When God chooses, he looks at the heart, not the outward appearance. The disciples were people like you and me, differing only in that they were willing to say yes to God's call. Many of you may already be following God's call. You may have joined one of the Marches for Life last week or this week as we prepare for Monday's call for the legal protection of the unborn. God calls us to remember the sanctity of life, the life he created. St. John Paul II used the phrase, "a culture of death," to describe the atmosphere of our world today. When we consider the sanctity of life, we must not forget those affected by euthanasia, assisted suicide, or genocide. Not only are the unborn, sick, and elderly at risk, but even our family structure is being attacked. Without our family structure to give us direction, our world is thrown into chaos. When we face this atmosphere, some of us may be bold and jump into action with conviction, but many of us may be reluctant Jonahs that God is calling to rise up out of our seats and comfort zone to help our world to repent and believe in the gospel, to turn our culture into a culture of life. How are we to stand How prepared are we to stand before God if we were to suddenly die today? Have we done everything we could to help our neighbors and the world to repent and believe in the gospel? Did we listen to God's call? Would our answer be different if we knew that when this time was coming and we could prepare for it? Would we do everything we could, pray for him to enlighten us, spend time in his presence during adoration, read his word, and spend time with others also wanting to know him? How much time do we have left? Listen for God's call now. Listen with your ears, but even more importantly, with your heart. God is calling. He is calling each of us to repent and turn away from evil and believe in the gospel and return to God. Listen for God's call and change from being a reluctant follower into an active disciple.